So Dale and I are having a very good conversation up here, but that's sort of not the point. So welcome to our bi-weekly seminar for the Permanent Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today. We're really thrilled to have somebody talking about something a little different than we might usually do. Dale and I were trying to figure out how long we've known each other and from where last, and it's a long time that we can't figure out, maybe because it's been so long ago, where we last saw each other. But he's a very important figure in environmental ethics and has been working on these issues and writing about them for a long time. He's currently at NYU, as you can see from the material in the announcement for this talk and on the slide behind me. I guess I'd say a bit professionally, he's written about the morality of climate change issues for a long time, but your book was 2008, if I'm remembering correctly. And then more recently in 2014, has written a book called Reason in a Dark Time, Why the Struggle to Stop Climate Change Failed and What It Means for Our Future. Certainly prescient, that was before the election of 2016, and here we are. So without belaboring it too much, welcome Dale. We look forward to what you have to say, and as usual, we'll hear a talk for about 45 minutes and then 15 minutes for questions and answers. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Well, so first of all, it's wonderful to be here, and you are a different audience than the sort of audience that I'm used to addressing as well. And so I've tried to design this talk in a way that has some specific morals for bioethics, but also fills in some of the background on climate change. And I hope that what this doesn't mean is that all of you are bored by what I have to say about climate change, except those who are bored by what I have to say about bioethics. So, but I guess I'll find out in the discussion section. So let's just get going then. So the other thing is, I tend to be kind of an audience roving, questioner stalking kind of guy, but because I don't have a remote for this, I'm going to have to be sort of stuck here behind the podium. So I hope that's not as boring for you as it is for me. So, all right. So the plan of the talk is this. First, I'm going to give you some background on climate change, which I think is important because I think even people who sort of follow the issue regularly tend not to understand what a long history scientific investigation of this issue has had, and also how long this issue has actually been known in policy circles as well. Then I'm going to put climate change in the context of what has come to be called the Anthropocene. Then I'm going to talk about some particular health challenges in the Anthropocene. And then I'm going to try to draw some morals for bioethics. So here we go. First, the primer on climate change. I should give you enough time to take on board the slide. Okay, so the history of the investigation of this issue really starts with Joseph Fourier, who discovered that the atmosphere traps heat in the 1820s. Now, one thing I want to point out is that in my slides, you'll see in the parentheses, when things are dated, you'll see in the parentheses this little notation of ppm. Those are the parts per million of carbon that was in the atmosphere at the time that person was writing. We're now at about 410 parts per million in the atmosphere. So when Fourier first discovered that the atmosphere traps heat, we were at 280 parts per million. I'm not going to point that out on every slide. That's just something for you to pick up. John Tyndall, the Anglo-Irish chemist, was the first really to identify the specific gases, or at least some of them, that trap heat. In particular, he discovered that water vapor was and carbon dioxide were heat-trapping gases. Svante Arrhenius, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on ionization in chemistry, almost as a hobby on those long, cold Swedish nights, did these laborious calculations by hand, trying to figure out what a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere would mean for the Earth's surface temperature, and he computed that it would be about a 1.5 to 4.5 degrees centigrade warming. Now, it turns out he actually really didn't understand the physics of how the heat-trapping properties of the atmosphere work. But nevertheless, the calculation was basically right. This is about what we get from supercomputer model runs. Guy Callender, who was an engineer working for the British Coal Board, actually in the 1930s, when there was a kind of spike up in temperature, claimed that global warming was already underway, and he was really the first to sort of compute in a relatively reliable way how much carbon had been emitted from anthropogenic sources at that point. Then we skip to the post-World War II period. Gilbert Ploss, who was a Canadian physicist, worked with very early computer models and ended his career as dean of the School of Engineering at Texas A&M University. But he computed that the average global temperature will increase at the rate of 1.1 degrees centigrade per century. Now Ploss was a very well-known popular writer during the 50s. By popular writer, I don't mean that he wrote for, Argosy or men's magazines. I mean, he wrote for things like Popular Mechanics, Popular Science, Scientific American. So these were not, classified documents or state secrets. This was well known to the scientifically literate public at that time. Roger Revelle, who some of you may know, among other things, he was Al Gore's teacher at Harvard. Apparently Al got a C, but that's another story. But Revelle was also the founder of the University of California in San Diego, was very involved in creating 1957 as the International Geophysical Year, was really a kind of science policy entrepreneur. And in 1957, he published a paper with Hans Seiss, who also won the Nobel Prize for his work on carbon dating. And they wrote that human beings are now carrying out a large-scale geophysical experiment of a kind that could not have happened in the past and would be repeated in the future. Within a few centuries, we are returning to the atmosphere and oceans the concentrated organic carbon stored in sedimentary rocks over hundreds of millions of years. Now, a couple of things I want you to note about this. The first is it's really this Revelle-Seiss paper from 1957 that really made this issue salient and, in a way that it began to get some traction in the policy community as well as raising its visibility in the scientific community. The other thing I want you to notice about this is actually this reads like a grant proposal. He's not saying this is a terrible thing. He's saying, gee, this is an interesting experiment. Let's study it. And that was pretty much Revelle's attitude, although he did advocate that we adopt policy to restrict the emissions of carbon later. But at this point, he's really calling for a scientific research program. So this issue clearly lands on the desk of the president for the first time in 1965 in a message to Congress by President Lyndon Johnson, in which he says, this generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through radioactive materials and a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. It would actually be nice if the president, occupant of the White House, was actually as clear about this point as President Johnson was more than a half century ago. But it wasn't just Lyndon Johnson and a bunch of Democratic liberals who saw this as an issue. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a White House domestic policy advisor to President Nixon and later went on to be Democratic senator from the state of New York, wrote a memo to John Ehrlichman, who was who reported directly to Nixon in 1969. He said, it's now pretty clearly agreed that the CO2 content will rise 25% by 2000. This could increase the average temperature near the Earth's surface by 7 degrees Fahrenheit. This, in turn, could raise the level of the sea by 10 feet. Goodbye, New York. Goodbye, Washington, for that matter. And then, like a good New Yorker, he adds, we have no data on Seattle. And again, this wasn't just in these White House documents. These are two headlines, above-the-fold headlines taken from the New York Times, one in 1977 and one in 1979, that looked like they could be ripped out of the newspaper yesterday. In 1979, the National Academy of Sciences issued its first report on anthropogenic climate change, and in its conclusion said that a wait-and-see policy may mean waiting until it's too late. And I guess somebody must have thought that was a policy recommendation. I don't know, but it's pretty much the policy we have in fact adopted. In 1988, there was a huge nationwide drought. Jim Hansen, back when he had a little more hair than he does today, testified to the Senate committee that global warming has begun. Senator Tim Wirth of Colorado, at that time, the same year, introduced something called a bipartisan bill. I know that's a word that's dropped out of the English language, but it refers to both political parties agreeing on something. With 15 co-sponsors that called for a 20% greenhouse gas emissions reduction from 1990 levels by 2000. So, I mean, the world would have been a completely different place had this bill been passed. And the fact that it had 15 co-sponsors from both the Republican and Democratic parties in 1988 is a pretty big wake-up call for how much the world has changed, and certainly how much the politics around this issue has changed. In 1988, the international process was begun to negotiate the Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was also created the same year to provide an objective international scientific basis for these negotiations. The Reagan administration supported the creation of the IPCC. And probably most of you know that these are reports that are written by experts really from all over the world. And if anything, they tend to understate the results of climate science because it's the nature of these consensus reports to be conservative. And actually, perhaps a bit strangely, the IPCC reports have to be approved not just by all the scientists involved, but actually by the governments involved as well. So all of the IPCC reports you see, the United States government, whoever was president, signed off on, and so did such radical climate hawks as Kuwait and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. So the first IPCC report was written in 1990. In 1992, we get the Rio Earth Summit, which was the largest gathering of heads of state ever brought together on the planet. The Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted and was shortly thereafter ratified by the United States Senate. And the Framework Convention states that the ultimate objective of the convention is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Arguably, all of the ratifiers of this treaty are now in breach. In 1995, we get the second IPCC report. The reason I'm throwing in these little passages from the IPCC reports is so that you see there's radical changes in the science here, starting from Fourier in the 1820s. What we get is like, we get the colors, we get more colors, we get more lines filled in. The jigsaw puzzle gets ever more creative. This is really a story of the growth of normal science. This is not a story of big upheavals in the science or revolutions or something we thought we knew, in fact, we discovered turns out entirely to be false. Because the voluntary commitments to reduce emissions were not succeeding, the countries came together in 1997 on the Kyoto Protocol, which established the first binding emissions limits for the industrialized countries. And it was really the negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol that brought climate change denial into existence, essentially as the epistemological arm of the fossil fuel industry. So the US ends up withdrawing from Kyoto. The IPCC continues to chug along, filling in ever greater details. In 2007, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the IPCC and Al Gore. Then there was a lot of enthusiasm about Barack Obama, who was committed to the reality of climate change and climate policy being elected. But the first conference of the parties after Obama came into power was really a disaster in Copenhagen. For all sorts of reasons, the US government wasn't really prepared. The Danish government was incompetent in its leadership of the negotiations. There was the rise of the so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, who are now much larger emitters. It wasn't clear how to involve them in a new treaty. And I actually love this picture because what this picture shows you is the most powerful people in the world, you know, sitting in one of these terrible rooms that all of us end up sitting in. And what they're trying to do is to scratch out an agreement on a legal pad so that they can get the hell out of town, you know, without being even more embarrassed than they already were by the collapse of the meeting. But in 2015, we get a successful agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, one thing I want to say about the Paris Climate Agreement, again, we can go into details and discussion if you want, but it really is essentially just a return to the Framework Convention and to the core principles of the Framework Convention with some additional clarity as well. So the key points of the Paris Agreement is that they're really voluntary pledges as occurred after the ratification of the Framework Convention, but now it includes all parties and not just the so-called developed countries. It does state a long-term global goal as net zero emissions. So you know how things work in the international arena. If you agree to something and you fail to achieve it, one response is to agree to something even stronger. This is essentially what happened in Paris. Every 5 years there is a stock-taking meeting. There's also supposed to be money for less developed countries to adapt to climate change. Loss and damage is just sort of the climate negotiation shorthand for what is essentially providing some money for tort damages. And the goal is to limit the warming to less than 2 degrees centigrade. Now, the numbers on this slide are not hugely reliable because there's this variable called climate sensitivity, about which there's differences of opinion. But the sort of conventional view is that if you want to stay on a 2 degree centigrade pathway, the amount of carbon that we emit every year has to drop radically from 2020. The current pledges will get us to about 3.5 degrees centigrade warming, which is much more than almost anyone thinks is tolerable. And if no action at all is taken, then we'll wind up at 4.5 degrees centigrade, although there's reason to believe the warming would be even more intense than that. Now, we hear a lot about what this means for the United States and other countries, and you can see the United States is in blue, and so our emissions have to come down pretty radically by the end of the century. But you can also see that the challenge is much greater for China and other developing countries if we're going to stay under this 2 degree target. Now, these are a series of slides just to kind of show you what this buildup of carbon in the atmosphere looks like over increasingly long time series. So this is a chart, and by the way, this is now out of date. As I say, we're pushing 410 parts per million. But we're used to see, a lot of us are probably used to seeing this figure. It's become really iconic. And this is the Mauna CO2 readings essentially normalized over seasonal variation. And you can see this steep upward climb since 1960. But this is what it looks like if we actually go back to the pre-industrial baseline. This is what it looks like if we go 200,000 years in the past. And this is what it looks like if we go 800,000 years in the past. So you can see that this spike up that we've been observing is something which looks even more anomalous the longer we go back, at least within the last 800,000 years. And of course, this has translated into increases in mean surface temperature. This is an interesting slide. And the kinds of climate change impacts that we expect to see are going to depend on the warming that we actually experience. So this is a very busy slide that shows you what happens at 1 degree, what happens at 2 degrees, what happens at 3 degrees. And this slide is going to be given to you sort of in different formats later in this talk, but what I want you to notice is that it's the nature of climate change for the consequences to ramify out through social systems. So another way of looking at it is like this. If we have a drought, where we have a storm, we have a hurricane, if this happens over the ocean or someplace which is unpopulated, either by human or animal populations that we care about, we're getting the climate change effect, but the consequences are not consequences that we care very much about. If this happens in a city, for example, then we start seeing property damage, death, destruction, and so on. So one story I like to tell about this is that for a long time, and it's still going to be true, the most expensive natural disaster that ever occurred in the United States was a hailstorm that struck Denver, Colorado, and wiped out literally hundreds, maybe thousands of BMWs and Mercedes, right? So the cost of this event was determined not so much by the meteorological event, but by the extremely valuable property that people had stupidly parked on the streets, right? So what happens as we get these effects is they ramify out through our social systems, through property ownership, through systems of government, through refugee flows, through agriculture, through trade, through government stability, and so on and so forth. And those are going to be the kind of long-term indirect effects that we can expect really over the next few centuries. Now, climate change is not just a one-off event, but it's actually happening against the background of really the human transformation of the planet. And so it needs to be seen really as a harbinger of what people are increasingly calling the Anthropocene. Just out of curiosity, how many people have heard that term? Okay. So the Anthropocene is really defined as an epoch in Earth's history in which fundamental Earth systems are dominated by humanity. And once again, I think the long time series is helpful here. If I had a pointer, I would help take us through these slides, but I'm going to go very quickly. So if the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old, the part that we're most interested in is the Cenozoic period, the so-called age of the mammals, which kicks in at 66 million years ago. So this is a tiny, tiny fraction of the entire history of the planet. Now, in this Cenozoic period, we start getting the transition from apes to hominids at about 5.3 million years ago, right? So most of the age of mammals, there's nothing that we feel very closely related to at all until we get to about 5.3 million years ago. Evolutionarily, modern people, in the sense of being physiologically identifiable as us, kicks in at about somewhere between 100 and 200,000 years ago. So most of that period where we have the ape-hominid transition, we don't have anatomically modern humans until relatively recently, in a very short period of that time. Almost everything that we consider to make us human in the cultural sense occurs in this period known to geologists as the Holocene, which is usually dated from about 11,600 years ago. So all of culture, writing, art, everything that we think contributes to our civilization virtually, not everything, but almost everything has occurred during this very short period. Now, this is what's happened in the Holocene. We've gone through different areas of social organization. Population has increased. It's increased exponentially in a relatively short period of time. And it's that's given rise to this language of the Anthropocene, that we're now living in this period at the end of that last spike, where the planet is now being so transformed by human population consumption that it's no longer can be thought of as the Holocene. So these are some indicators of human influence on the atmosphere that go beyond carbon. So the chart on the left is essentially shows you the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, about which I've talked a lot. But next to it is a chart on nitrous oxide, and then below that methane, and then below that sulfate aerosols in the atmosphere. And we could go on and on with these physical indicators. We could talk about the nitrogen cycle. We could talk about other chemical cycles that have been radically transformed by human action. And this gets expressed in all sorts of ways. You probably can't read these graphs, but these are all sorts of indicators that people have thought about as indicators of the Anthropocene. Now, one simple way of thinking about how much human appropriation there is of the Earth system is, I think, just to look at this chart. So what this chart is a chart of is essentially mammal biomass. Okay, not numbers, but biomass. And essentially, if you look at these different taxa, the squares that are in green represent the biomass of animals in that taxa that are not under human control or domestication. And so what this shows you is that all of this stuff about protecting nature, protecting animals, the charismatic megafauna that means so much to us, and so on and so forth, only a vanishingly small fraction in terms of its biomass actually remains not under direct human control. The Anthropocene is also characterized by globalization, is one of the features of the Anthropocene. We're connected in all sorts of ways at both the level of physical infrastructure. And if you wanted to see, I think, just a visual image of what the Anthropocene looks like compared to the Holocene, it would be this. This is a picture of Manhattan Island, and what you see on the left is more or less how it looked when Henry Hudson sailed up the Hudson estuary in the early part of the 17th century. There were people living there. There were the Lenape Indians living there, a relatively small population. And what you see on the right is the city we all know and love today. So, sometimes people will talk about, well, people have always affected nature. What's this Anthropocene stuff? It's not so different, so on and so forth. And I say, just look at this picture and tell me that there isn't something that's significantly different that's occurring now from what was occurring 11,600 years ago. So the Anthropocene is fed by large populations, by high levels of consumption, and by the power of technology and our reliance on technology. It's not a topic I'm going to go into in the talk today, but I think one thing that's characteristic of the Anthropocene is that never has humanity been so powerful. Collectively, we are transforming the planet, but I don't think since the 18th century have we ever felt so powerless as individuals. So there's a kind of paradox about human agency, I think, at the core of the Anthropocene. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little about health challenges of the Anthropocene. And this slide is in a way sort of symbolic of what I want to talk about here. And in this slide, of course, you see a human whose health we're concerned with. We see a marooned animal, and we see deforestation. And so what we'll see in the Anthropocene is a kind of triangular relationship between these things. Now, I don't think that we have actually a very good way of thinking about the health impacts or the relationship between health and the Anthropocene. This is a slide from a PNAS article in which Samuel Myers was the lead article, which is probably the most commonly reproduced graphic for trying to describe the complex relationships between environmental change and human health. Again, I don't think this really does the job, but it's one way of looking at it. So the conceptualization here is that essentially, if we think of human health outcomes as being sort of in the middle of these concentric circles, on this schematic, what essentially happens is that human health is protected by various things that are in the outer part of these concentric circles. Changes in land, resource scarcity, climate change deteriorates ecosystem services, and what that does is to penetrate through those circles of protection and begin to compromise human health. So again, it's one way of thinking about the relationship, I think, between the environment and human health. It's not the only way, maybe not the best way, but it probably is currently the most influential way. And we do begin to get the idea of how these things all relate to each other. Now, if we just focus again on climate change in particular, what this figure shows you is how the physical changes in the system, rising temperatures, changes in precipitation, weather extreme events, then lead to this outer circle of things like water and food scarcity, heat, and so on and so forth, which then leads to yet more indirect effects like malnutrition, diarrhea, algal blooms, and so on and so forth. So in a way, the point I'm really wanting to make with these two slides is that I don't think we've yet really succeeded in conceptualizing the relationship between human health and the environment. These are two ways that are beginning to try to do this, but there's still a lot more work to be done, and there's different perspectives one can take on this. Now, quantifying this is a whole other incredibly difficult matter, and you can imagine why it's so difficult to quantify. It's difficult both because climate change impacts are going to go out centuries into the future. Climate change makes itself felt in all kinds of ways, mostly indirect. climate change, if it kills 1 million people, none of them will you read in the obituary column of the New York Times that they died cause of death climate change, right? That's not the right scale of explanation. This is an attempt to quantify this. This is put out by an NGO that tries to put some numbers on the expected deaths. Again, not to take the numbers very seriously, but just to recognize that not only do we have a hard time conceptualizing the pathways at this point and the relationships, but actually quantifying it is difficult. But we do know some things. For example, we know that most new human infectious diseases really come from animal infectious diseases, and we also know those animal infectious diseases often have a lot to do with land use changes, such as deforestation. And it's in response to this kind of knowledge that we are seeing movements like the One Health movement, which is probably familiar to some of you in this room, which I think can sort of be dated from 2004, when the Wildlife Conservation Society in New York brought together a meeting at Rockefeller University. And the basic One Health concept now has been endorsed by all kinds of surprising organizations, including the CDC and important Republican senators and so on. And basically the One Health idea is that human health, animal health, and environmental health are really all entwined together, and that you can't really promote one kind of health without promoting the health of all of its elements. Now, even more recently, some of you may have noticed that the Lancet, with the support of the Rockefeller Foundation, has actually launched a new journal after having done a lot of previous publication in this area going back to 2015. And they've been promoting the idea that there's a new discipline, or at least one that we ought to create, which is the discipline of planetary health. The idea is that the health of human civilization and the natural systems on which it depends. And they've been putting out, the Lancet has been putting out graphics like this one, which, as I say, comes from the publication just earlier this month, promoting the new journal. And you know, there's a lot to say about this when people have these new health concepts and promote the idea of these new disciplines and so on, right? Because, I mean, often these things are just sort of buzzwords. Sometimes they're useful attempts at consciousness raising. Sometimes they're more than that. But these are all ways that people are trying to grasp at how we should think about the interactions between health and the natural environment in the Anthropocene. Now, I just want to say that I've got an issue with this, though, that I want to put on the table, which is that I think that often when we run into these kinds of very broad-scale problems, people will do their best to try to drain them of normative content. And the idea of the language of health is often a way of trying to do that. So in the environmental area, going back to the late 1990s, instead of arguing about what we want nature to be like and what kinds of ecosystems we prefer and disprefer, the concept of ecosystem health was introduced into the literature. And the idea is, well, the idea of health sounds kind of objective, and so these terrible developers who are ripping things down that we like, it's not just that they're doing things that we don't like or that pose some risks, it's that they're creating an unhealthy ecosystem. Well, the first problem is that when we talk about planetary health or ecosystem health, it's very hard to know what that's supposed to mean in any objective sense. It's a big extension from the idea of human health. One reason we care about human health is that because people care about their own health. Ecosystems do not care about their own health. Planets do not care about their own health. So there's an issue about the extension of the concept of health in these ways. But of course, health itself is already a normative concept. So, and it's not just that the idea of what it is for me to be healthy is a normative concept, but when we're talking about problems of the Anthropocene and problems of climate change, we are immediately involved in talking about issues of justice. So what this map reflects is where the expected mortality from climate change is likely to occur. And as you can see, the United States is not where it's happening, right? It's Africa, it's Asia. So there's an issue of justice that is really sort of at the core of these concerns about planetary justice. So what I want to say is, however helpful or not helpful these extensions of the concept of health may or may not be, there is a job for bioethics here. I mean, we have this perfectly good field that we call bioethics that deals with the normative dimensions of health and of medical and more broadly of biological concerns. And in the face of the issues of the Anthropocene, we need to broaden our conception of bioethics. And I want to say that that I'm presenting these considerations now in the last part of the talk as if I've thought them all up by myself and no one else has ever had these ideas and bioethics is all stuck in the past and so on. That's not true. The kind of change that I'm talking about is already starting to occur, or there's certainly glimmerings of this change. What I want to do is to push it along. So you'll have to forgive then some stereotyping, which I think is not entirely false. So there's something that we can think of as canonical bioethics, which is typically thought of as a branch of applied ethics. It's thought of as being autonomous from science. And I must say, by the way, for each of these considerations, there's both good reasons and institutionally self-serving reasons for doing all of these things, right? So it doesn't come from nowhere. It's not like somebody just had this idea about how to construct the field, right? There's reasons for it. But canonical bioethics, branch of applied ethics, autonomous from science, focusing on concrete medical dilemmas, primarily in the areas that I list, and aimed primarily at resolving concrete moral problems through the application of already established ethical principles. So the caricature is that the bioethicist is someone, who kind of has a quiver on their back, and you've got an ethical quandary over here, and the bioethicist takes the arrow out, shoots it at the ethical quandary, and and the good guys win, and the bad thing disappears. And of course, the kind of core values that we learn in bioethics textbooks are values of beneficence, respect, autonomy, and justice. But it's not entirely clear, actually, even in a lot of traditional bioethics contexts, how these values apply. But it's certainly not clear how they apply in the Anthropocene. Now, what I want to do is to remind us that there was another way into bioethics. There was a road not taken that's worth re-examining. And the guide on that road was Van Rensselaer-Potter, who was actually the person who coined the term bioethics. He was a professor in the medical school at the University of Wisconsin. And he was actually a generation younger than Aldo Leopold, who some of you may know is often thought of as sort of the great intellectual leader, forebearer of the American environmental movement, the author of Sand County Almanac. And Potter's last book, which was published in 1988, was actually called Global Bioethics, Building on the Leopold Legacy. So Potter quite explicitly tied his conception of bioethics to this concern about the environment. And in that book, he defined global bioethics as a new discipline. Everyone likes to invent new discipline. As a new discipline devoted to the science of survival. And rather than seeing it as a branch of applied ethics with some autonomy from science, he saw it as a bridge between the two cultures of science and the humanities, where the ultimate goal of this discipline is not only to enrich individual lives, but to prolong the survival of the human species in an acceptable form of society. So what I want to do then is to leave you with some new questions for bioethics, and then give you a counterpoint to that, and then quickly draw some conclusions. So I think if we were to follow the Van Rensselaer-Potter line, it would raise these kinds of questions. We'd have to ask, how much do we value nature, animals, and people, both generally and in very specific acute situations? How do we allocate resources among them? So, for example, how much do we spend treating an acute condition, for example, a patient with an infectious disease, as opposed to promoting system health, say, preventing deforestation? How do we allocate human resources, healthcare provider resources among them. How much money do we put in nursing? How much do we put in terms of forest guardians, for example? And how should we think about the drivers of environmental degradation, which are population and consumption, which are typically not much taken into account when we speak in the bioethics community. Now, I think one response to this would be to say, well, look, there's nothing new under the sun, and questions of equality and priority arise in canonical bioethics as well, and the conflict between acute care and prevention already exists. So how much do we spend in treatment? How much do we spend on vaccine programs, for example? But I want to say that I think the issue is even that, well, the first thing I want to do is acknowledge that we're living at this kind of amazingly paradoxical time. So if the first slide, which harkens back to other slides I've shown you, are measures of the Anthropocene, where essentially the human appropriation and degradation of nature is quite extreme. At the same time, human health outcomes have never been better. Now, how do you think about that? One way of thinking about that is that we've been able to substitute for things in the natural world, so we no longer need the natural world in the same way that we did. The other way to think about that is we really are seriously living on borrowed time. I want to say that whatever is true of these questions, and these are all good and difficult questions, there is a kind of conceptual shift that looking at things from the Van Rensselaer-Potter perspective brings with it. And I want to orient this around the concept of shifting baselines, which is a very important concept generally in environmental management. Now, people in health professions and in bioethics are used to thinking about shifting baselines. They don't use those terms, but that's what you're talking about when you think about patients' health, patients' bodies, for example. When somebody has a fever, you think they have a fever, but then you discover that actually there's someone who runs 0.6 of a degree Fahrenheit above what you had thought was the norm. The baseline has shifted. When somebody has a health problem that you manage, they can't do things other people do, the baseline has shifted to a new normal, and you manage to that baseline. So the concept of shifting baselines is one that's readily available when it comes to the health professions when we think about patients' bodies. It gets a little more problematical when we turn to populations. What does it mean, for example, what's the baseline for a 70-year-old male as opposed to the baseline for one particular 70-year-old male? Those are the kinds of new challenges that population health begins to raise for the traditional patient-oriented health. But then there are also questions about the baselines for healthcare systems. One of the arguments that we're going through now with Obamacare and Obamacare repeal really is about whether healthcare is a right, and if so, how substantive a right is it? What is our baseline? Have we shifted baselines because of the Affordable Care Act? We're going to find out. Then there's also a kind of societal baseline that can shift. If we're a poor society, what do we think of as the baseline of healthcare that we can provide relative to a rich society? There's also the idea of the natural background. So we think when somebody passes away at age 90 that this is just part of nature. It's part of the natural baseline, the natural background. Some guys in Silicon Valley want to challenge our taking that as part of the natural background. But what all of these ways of thinking about baselines assumes is that Earth's systems remain a fixed and unchangeable natural background. And what I want to suggest is that thinking of bioethics in the way that Van Rensselaer-Potter wants us to think about bioethics is to recognize that even Earth systems themselves are subject to shifting baselines and don't provide a fixed natural background against which we can measure success in all these other areas. So thank you very much for your patience, and we've got a little time for questions.
Just a reminder that it's helpful to speak into the mic for the purposes of tape.
So I don't know if you saw the video. It was Bill Nye and William Happer on CNN. And so William Happer Princeton scientist, represented essentially the climate change denialist camp. And he said that the data that was presented is either false or falsely interpreted. So all of the slides that you showed us today in the first half were, let's just take the benefit of our audience of being scientifically literate. What do you say to the rest of the people who might take issue with the data and say, well, that's not true, or it's maybe just being looked at through an ideological lens?
So I really have two responses. The first might sound a little bit off your subject, but I think it is really important. The first is that I really don't, contrary to many of my colleagues, I don't think climate change denial is really the core of the issue that we face when it comes to acting on climate change. I mean, I've tried to explain this in my book, Reason in the Dark Time, that I think the real drivers are elsewhere. There's something about our society that, you know, we're somehow an excessively Protestant society, that we think everybody has to have all the same beliefs before we can go forward on something. But in most areas of life, it's not like that. You can have whatever beliefs you want about all kinds of things, and we still manage to make social policy to take action. So I tend to view climate change denial as more epiphenomenal, that it's basically a product of there being huge resistance to change in the society, some of it economic, some of it status quo bias, all kinds of things. And so we generate this climate change denial. And I mean, I feel like I've seen this up close because in the 80s, I had an appointment at the National Center for Atmospheric Research where a lot of the early climate change work was done. And of course, in any area of science, there are always uncertainties. Claims are always probabilistic. They gain their robustness by the predictions being confirmed, by details being filled in as we go through time. But at any given point in time, there's always these questions that can be raised. There's a quite well-known climate change denier who used to come to our seminars, and then he would sort of go out and write newspaper articles in which all the uncertainties that would be identified, he would basically say, this stuff is no good, they don't even know about this, that, and the other thing, right? And so at least in the first generation of climate change denial, it was more a matter of not taking the uncertainties in context and exaggerating them and taking them out of context that was so misleading. Now we just have wholesale fabrication.
Hi, Dale. Thanks for the talk. It was great to hear climate change talk in the Thurman Institute seminar, so thanks for coming. I want to ask one question that's kind of got a large view of where you ended. So you had a slide a few slides back where you said at the bottom, we end up with this kind of perspective of the two basic drivers, population and consumption. And so for the last several decades, we've actually had a fairly marginal voice, now anyway, but saying something about both at the planetary scale. So you have a kind of population concern movement, and then you have a steady state economics movement from people like Herman Daly. And so both sides are kind of saying, look, the very basic premise of our worries when we take the kind of view that this might push us towards is that a finite set of resources in a closed system can't support infinite growth. And if these are the two sources of growth, one of them's got to go. So you kind of end here on, here are these two big drivers, but you didn't say a whole lot to kind of push either one of those directions. So I guess I just wondered if you could give a couple minutes of thought with us about that.
Yeah, so this will at least give you the guardrails for thinking about this. Part of the problem with the discussion of population and consumption is that it's been too dichotomous. So people on the steady state consumption side, basically want to say, look, so we start from the inside, that there can't be infinite growth in a finite system. That's absolutely true. But that doesn't tell us how much growth there can be in a finite system, right? So one way of charitably reading what economists are saying is, no, we don't believe there can be infinite growth. That's not what we're saying. We're just saying there can be a whole lot more growth because there's a lot of substitution that takes place for natural capital, et cetera, et cetera. And on the other side, you have people saying, no, it has to be steady state here and now, right? And as a result, we tend not to have much reasoned examination of how much substitution can reasonably occur and what are the losses in quality of life when substitution occurs and so on and so forth. So there tend to be these caricatures of both sides and not much filling in the middle. And I feel like something like that happens in the population debate as well. That there were, honestly, I think Paul and Ann Ehrlich were misunderstood, but there was a big reaction against books like The Population Bomb and so on, which were read as asserting that the whole problem with the world is that there's too many people, and in particular, too many non-white people. That's essentially how that book was read. I think it was unfair, but there was a lot of unartful language in that book. And as a result, then talking about populations sort of became off the table for a long time. And people would talk about things like, what I think are sort of religious concepts, like the demographic transition and population stability and so on. And and it's not as though there aren't these statistical trends that occur, but why would anybody think that nature or God intended the Earth to have a stable human population? That there's some end point that when we achieve it, then things are going to be in some stable equilibrium state. That isn't how nature works. That's how ecosystems work. Why should human population work that way? So anyway, so I think there's a lot of discussion on both of these issues that now maybe we can sort of start to have instead of just, sort of flinging mud at each extreme. So.
I have a question about the Global South. So one of the criticisms that is sometimes made from the corner of critical race studies and post-colonial theory to the environmentalist movement is that, especially in the context of climate change policies that specifically target the developing world end up, even if it's not intended, they sort of end up being branches of kind of first world policy for preventing the development of third world nations. And so, this was one of the debates about the Kyoto Protocol, that many of the nations that were excluded from, I think, Annex 1, I forget the breakdown of the two annexes, like India and China, you need to include them in the solution in order to be efficacious, but at the same time holding those countries accountable to the same standard as Western, European, and North American countries. There is something odd about that, especially because those countries have already sort of taken the benefit of industrialization, which has resulted in their economic superiority. So I'm just wondering how you deal with that issue.
Sure. So, this is a really big topic, and I'll just say three fairly dogmatic things. And I talk a lot more about this in Reason in the Dark Time and also in some of my other writings. But the first thing to say is that there are many, many different perspectives one can take on the global justice issues involved with climate change. And there's not a single unique perspective, in my opinion, that can be normatively justified to the exclusion of all others. So that's part of the problem. We're dealing with a kind of zone of indeterminacy. That's the first thing. Secondly, in terms of the actual practical debate, virtually every nation in the world, except the small island states, who are the complete unalloyed victims of this whole business because they're going to be underwater. But countries like India and China, for example, have also, like the United States, have essentially mobilized those conceptions of justice that best serve their own interests. And that's been also part of why it's difficult to reach an international agreement. Now, that's all problematical because we're not, with climate change, talking, and here I disagree with some other people who've written about climate ethics, we're not really talking much about how to divide up some pot of the remaining global carbon pie or something. The real issue is about a global change of state, of moving from a fossil fuel-driven energy system to a renewable energy system. That's the global challenge. That will happen, it has to happen, and that's the real question. So it's not like most questions of distributed justice, who gets how much of the cake and who gets the little parts of the cake. So the problem is that, so what the world did in Paris, in effect, since we couldn't agree on a unique view about justice, was to say that each nation can simply make its own pledges, recognizing that really we all have to get there together. And I think that's not a bad way of proceeding. But it only will succeed if global civil society essentially pressurizes and shames corporate institutions and national states, both in the developed and developing world, to actually move the world towards a sustainable future. So,
Let me take the last question, moving the microphone, and ask you actually a question about your, I think, probably correct claim about canonical bioethics and how it evolved, which in large part is about the role of stakeholders, having an interest in what we call bioethics being done in particular kinds of institutions. So if we are to see a shift of the kind you're suggesting, where are the institutional stakeholders that will be supportive of, if not have an interest in, right, a kind of shift from what you call canonical bioethics?
so I think this is practically the most important question in this whole game. And just to provide a little background on the non-answer I'm about to give, a generation of people who worked in environmental ethics and environmental values were actually quite jealous of people in bioethics because there was actually a job market for bioethicists and institutions that actually were interested in hearing what they had to say, which wasn't true in the case of environmental ethics. Essentially, these concerns about the environment have become much more robust now, and so it's not quite the same situation that it was. But if you just take a specific area, like the relationship between climate change and health, this is the most neglected research area when it comes to climate change. And part of the explanation, I won't say all of it, but part of the explanation is very simple. It's because NSF doesn't fund health and NIH doesn't fund environment. And so we're facing what may be the most profound health challenge of our time, and it falling outside the silos of our major funding agencies. I think there are signs that this may be beginning to change, but it is a huge obstacle to getting the research activities going in this area that we need. And the first step, of course, is to be aware of it and to start hollering about it and say that it's just as important to fund climate and health as it is to increase increments in various disease categories.
I guess we'll have to end there. I think you're probably right, and unfortunately it's a bit depressing given the prospect for funding in both of the areas that you mentioned. But we'll leave that for another time. Thanks, Dale. Let's all join in. Quick reminder, next seminar is the 8th of May.